Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PwC Tax Bite podcast series. My name is Pieter de Ree, Global Tax Director at PwC Brussels, and I welcome you to this somewhat special edition of our Tax Bite podcast series. In this podcast series, we normally talk about relevant developments in the international tax world with experts in the field. I invite you to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Apple, Spotify, or Google. This episode is somewhat special because I'm very pleased to have with me in my virtual recording studio Gilles Fransen, part of our transfer pricing team, and Stefan de Baats, who does not need an introduction, I think, for the audience, to talk about the PwC Belgium Tax Webinar Week that took place last week. Indeed, last week, in this Tax Webinar Week, every day a session was held on a very specific, hot international topic. And in this series and this podcast, I would like to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit with Gilles and Stefan on what was said during last week. Are there main themes? Are there red wires throughout the seminar week? So I would be very interesting to talk about that. But first of all, Gilles, you took the lead in organizing this week. I must say, congratulations. It was a huge success. How did it feel on your side to organize this webinar week?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. I think it was quite interesting because it was obviously all virtual, which is new in terms of organizing events because we typically had the physical events. But it was quite interesting to organize it in a virtual way. Everything went fairly smooth as well, I think, in terms of technology, which is always a bit of a potential troublemaker there, but ultimately it went quite okay. I think the feedback we got from the clients who attended the sessions live was also quite good. So I was quite happy with the organization of the event.
Well, you did wonderful, Gilles. So really, congratulations again. It was very, very good to see how well it all went. So well done. Stefan, a question for you. Was this webinar week at the right moment in time? Was it good to do it last week?
Thank you, Peter, and good day to everyone. And indeed, congratulations, Gilles. Yes, I think the webinar week came at the right time. In particular, if we look at everything that's going on in the international tax scene, indeed, it was, I think, spot on. How we tackled this webinar week, or at least the basis for organizing it, was the different challenges from all the different channels that we see coming at companies, not only looking at what is happening today, but actually kind of forward looking as well. And I think that was the main force of this webinar week, really trying to be forward looking. At the same time, also looking at the external and internal pressures that companies, that our clients might feel. One elephant in the room is obviously the COVID pandemic, where all the enterprises have to deal with. And we have seen so many organizations going through major shifts, dealing with new kinds of situations. So the aim of our webinar week was to approach kind of this forward-looking, rather, as I indicated already, rather than a static analysis of the measures that are valid today. So really being proactive, really going, I would say, the additional mile into the future. This is in particular important because we see COVID and all the things that go around it as an accelerator for change. Think about technology, think about home working, and we will address it a bit further down the road in this podcast. And it is already forming part of the organizational strategy. So therefore, it was indeed important to spend time and some reflections on what these trends precisely are, what they mean to our clients, to the companies, and how they can actually have an impact on the overall tax function. So when we look at some of the internal and external pressure points, for example, the major internal pressure points we see, or the shifts that we see coming out of this new kind of realities, the new situations are, for example, the importance of cash to ensure business continuity. So we see indeed a downturn of the economy. Companies need cash. Financial transactions is an example thereof. A shift in the way that organizations are run, with an interesting trend towards flexible working from home, working from anywhere. And this will not be going away post-COVID. So it is a new reality. Also, the significant acceleration in the uptake of technology, not only communications, we're all Zooming, meeting virtually, teaming up through Teams, whatever. That's one element that has really been driven and that will also continue, but also in the build-up of business models. Think about direct to consumer business models. So, as companies embrace the new technologies, we often see this as a strategic pillar throughout the organization, but also impacting, for example, the automation of internal processes as an important, as an important key performance indicator. This is what concerns the internal pressure points. External pressure points, for example, companies are dealing with a significant uptake in unilateral, regional, and global tax reforms. Think about the OECD, the inclusive framework, the pillars, but also think about the European Union, the transparencies, DAC 6, DAC 7, DAC 8, very likely DAC 9, perhaps next year or within 2 years. Who will know? But at least that's continuing. Think about GRI. Think about environmental, social governance approaches. All these kind of things. So linked to that, there are a range of factors that also are linked to it. I mean, budgetary concerns. For example, the European Union seeking to establish its own set of income, also to finance the COVID experience. Continued push towards transparency, as I mentioned, the different DACs, and continuing public country by country reporting as well, for example. A wish to redesign the tax framework and how taxing rights may need to be allocated between source and resident states, the two pillars, for example. So, but Jill, precisely, what did we discuss about? Can you give us a quick recap on how we tied all these evolutions in during our webinar week? How did we tackle them?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan, for setting the scene on this one a bit. So, if we look at those those different pressures, both from an internal and external perspective, which actually distilled 5 core topics where we actually see a fairly important corporate tax impact. And for each of the topics, we actually organized during the week then a 1-hour presentation with topic matter experts to discuss some of the key items which companies should be thinking about. And let's maybe break that down a bit. So let's maybe start by looking at some of the external pressures. So from a tax policy perspective, unilateral, regional, global changes in tax rules. And you will probably have noticed from previous podcast episodes as well that there's a lot here. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of changes happening. So what we did in an initial session of our webinar week is to break those down into a few of the major shifts which we see happening. So first of all, you have the OECD Pillar 1, Pillar 2 project, which is introducing a reallocation of taxing rights, as well as introducing then a global minimum tax, also considering the recent US proposals in this area. Second, as mentioned by Stefan, there's the continued trend in terms of transparency, both in terms of mandatory measures such as the different DACs, public country by country reporting, but also voluntary tax transparency, where some countries are moving towards increased transparency, for example, under the GRI standards, or providing a view on, say, total tax contribution, linking them back to the overall ESG agenda. And finally, of course, there's the EU roadmap on taxation, where there's also a very big focus on environmental change. So where you have the subsidy carrot and the carbon tax stick, if you will. Obviously, there's also an interaction there in the EU agenda with the other elements. So the elements on transparency, digital taxation. And this is also where we're expecting an important publication on the 14th of July, actually. And maybe Peter, bouncing the ball a bit back to you. This is normally not how the podcasts go, but you were actually also one of the presenters in the first session, so maybe worth also getting your view on these different trends.
Yeah, sure, indeed. I was very pleased that I could present together with three fellow presenters the session on tax developments, policy developments, and I must say it was very nice to do, but also a big challenge because we had 45 minutes, I think, to summarize the key developments. And with developments at so many levels, OECD, interaction with Europe, US, Asia, Africa, so tying everything together with a huge speed of change, it was a real challenge to tackle that in 45 minutes. But the feedback that I got from audience that followed our session was that indeed it gave a good overview of where we are today on all the different topics, and a lot to digest. But I feel a little bit that it's not easy for business to just follow all these developments. And then I guess it's useful to get an overview, a recap in 45 minutes of where we are. And I think that was what I saw glimmering through in the feedback that we got. And thank you for giving the overview and summarizing the developments all together. But I have good news, of course, for that audience, because if you want to stay tuned, there's a very easy way to do that, and that is, of course, following this podcast. Then you are up to date with all the developments. No, a little joke, Gilles, but just to say it was really nice to do the session on policy developments. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. So maybe after that bit of hidden commercial, so breaking it down a bit further, thinking about, okay, we talked a bit about the external factors. Stefan also mentioned a number of internal pressures, right? So one of the some of the most important of those internal pressures are the likes of cash, the importance there of flexible working arrangements, how technology is used within the organization. And if we maybe start breaking this one down a bit as well. So let's maybe start with the cash angle. So this was a major pressure point a year ago, especially for companies which were impacted heavily by the pandemic. But it also remains an important area as companies invest into new and expanding business models. So based on our interactions with clients in this space, we actually identified two main topics which we then ultimately also covered in the webinar week. So first session actually looked at grants and incentives, where we covered a fairly wide spectrum, such as cash subsidies on a Belgian and European level, as well as tax incentives such as patent boxes, employee cost reductions, etc.
I must say, on that part, there was a lot of interaction and a lot of questions, I remember, that we received. Lots of clients and business were interested in these subsidies. What was your takeaway from the session? I think you followed it as well.
Yeah, that's right. So a key takeaway for me when it comes to the grants and incentives is the vast amount of opportunities in this space, which makes it very important to make sure that innovation and investment footprint of the organization is looked at from the different angles rather than through individual silos, say, to avoid that you would miss out on certain benefits, really. Maybe going down the road and continuing on the topic of cash, there was another session which was organized, which actually dealt with intra-group financing. And it's been over a year now since we had the introduction of a range of new rules and regulations in this area. An important recent development being the new OECD Chapter 10. And obviously, there's also the EBITDA rules, which were introduced to the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive. And a main takeaway here is that these rules have significantly expanded the guardrails when it comes to intragroup financing. It's not just about setting the interest rate. And ultimately, the theoretical framework and combining all of the different angles here can start getting quite confusing. So I quite liked how our colleagues presented this session by making use of an example or a case study to go through the different ins and outs of the rules. Now, maybe moving away from cash then as one of the concern areas or challenges, say, and looking at some other internal pressures or opportunities, if you will. And that's one around the new way of working, so remote working, flexible working, etc. Like many of you who are listening to the podcast right now, we are also recording this podcast from our home office or home recording studios, as Peter elegantly put it. And today, the remote working is still out of necessity, of course, but many organizations are also seeing, well, how can we start structuring our remote workforce and basically bake that into the overall talent acquisition or retention strategies.
And I must say, Gilles, on this point, when I talk to clients about remote working and so on, one of the things that always come up in the discussion is the vast amount of different departments that get an interest in this debate, working from home, working flexible. Is this something that you noticed as well in the session?
Yeah, that's right. And perhaps even more so than some of the other sessions, this topic is a bit like constructing a house of cards, where you have cards, not cars, of course, where you have tax and HR teams, where you need to think carefully about different angles. So there's the HR law, there's social security, there's the permanent establishment risk, there's the transfer pricing model, etc., etc. And the session actually touched base on some of the core elements here, which need to be borne in mind as companies go about structuring their remote working strategy or organization, and also moved into some more practical examples on, well, which are the types of operating models that may suit such a new way of working. A final topic then, which ultimately closed out the week, was a session on tax technology. So this ties back to the focus we've seen companies place on automation and embracing technologies to make sure you free up time from repetitive tasks, such as, for example, plugging in financial data into TP local files for 20, 30, 100 countries. But also importantly, be able to create some insights through the technology into the overall tax structure in a couple of minutes, rather than having to consult finance teams in every single country to obtain the data. And the way our colleagues broke this down into the session is by going through a few very concrete client cases or examples or demos of the technology, really, and demonstrating, well, what is the role technology can play within the organization. So maybe with that, that was sort of a wrap up or a summary of the 5 main topics which we covered during the webinar week. I'll maybe pass the word back to Stefan to see if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. This reminds me of when we started preparing for this seminar, when we wanted to, as a couple of first slides, introduce all the devolutions through a way of a timeline, and where we were able to catch all the evolutions in one single timeline, where we had to make significant choices, just indicating how much is going on and how much complexity there is involved. And I think as you rightly summarized the topics that we discussed during these in total 5 hours of webinars, even at a high level, you need 5 hours of webinars to explain what will be going on in the near future, which is incredible. So that much is going on. But as your summary demonstrates, we actually started from core focus areas where we see companies evolving towards and tied. Where are these companies evolving towards actually? And linking this back again to the role of the tax function. This linking back to the tax function may be causing problems, but it's not perhaps a problem. It might be perhaps other opportunities that might be raising. That's one thing. Of course, the risk associated with these new opportunities also needs to be monitored. But let's focus on the opportunities, I would say. Also, what we touched upon are the tax effects of COVID, the new normal, say, home working, remote working, working from anywhere, whatever, new engagement facilities, the international context, the OECD developments, the EU developments, the digital levies, the transparency elements that go on, the new technologies. So I would say, all in all, a bit too much to give a real wrap up of what we have been saying. But there's a way forward here as well, because the recordings of the webinars are all available. So all you need to do is send an email or pick up the phone and give us a call to get access to the recordings.
Well, thanks so much, Stefan and Jill, for this wrap up and your view on the main takeaways from the seminar week. We're come at the end of the podcast, so before I close the podcast, I have one final question for you, Jill. As organizer of this event, what do you prefer, a virtual webinar week or a physical one?
Well, my personal preference is to actually have a physical webinar, not just because of the drinks which are typically organized at the end of such session, but also to basically get the live reactions and sort of feedback of the audience. But I think when looking at the feedback we got from clients, we got a lot of positive feedback on a virtual type of webinar. And we actually had half of the participants saying that they prefer this virtual type of webinar over a physical one, with the other half basically preferring a sort of hybrid style of event. So I think this is something we will take into account as well as we would organize events post-COVID in a world where hopefully we can have the opportunity to organize stuff physically again.
Well, thank you, Jill, for sharing that. And now we are really at the end of the podcast. So thank you very much, Stefan and Jill, for joining me in the virtual recording studio. For the audience, I want to just reiterate that the podcasts are available on Spotify, Apple, and Google. You can just register and you always get the latest updates on this podcast. And with that, I thank everyone and hope to speak to you soon.